This is Duke University.
Hi, my name is Max Lazar. I'm a second-year student in the Master's and PhD program in history from down the road in Chapel Hill. And the project I'm working on with the Council for European Studies here at Duke is related to my master's thesis, which focuses on second-generation Jews in East and West Germany and the reconceptualization and, in many ways, the reinvigoration of Jewish life in post-Holocaust Germany.
And I'm Sam Kessler, also from down the road in Chapel Hill. I'm a sixth-year doctoral candidate in religious studies, and my dissertation looks at the other side of this story, sort of the early part of the 19th century in Central Europe, in the various German states and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Austrian Empire before 1867. And the way that Jews migrated to cities and that first generation of building Jewish infrastructure, looking at synagogues, figuring out who the rabbi was going to be and what his role would be in the community. And so we decided to have this conversation because we sort of talk about two sides of the Second World War, two sides really of the great flowering of Jewish life in late 19th century and early 20th century Central Europe. And Max talks about sort of how you recover from the loss of flourishing, and I talk about how we get to the period of flourishing. And so we were excited to try and figure out a way to talk about those two aspects of German Jewish history, which in fact aren't necessarily always the most discussed.
Yeah. So Sam, I was wondering if we could start off by talking a little bit about this model that you put forward in your paper. This is the introduction to your dissertation about Anglo-American Jewry on some level, and how on many levels, I mean, this is looking at sort of, I guess, a global German Jewish effect on some level. This is the direct descendant of Central European Jewry in the 19th century and the challenges that it faced with modernity. So I was wondering if you could tell us, what are the sort of main constitutive elements of this Anglo-American Jewry that you conceive that can be traced back to the 19th century?
Well, thanks for that question. It already brought us sort of into the post-war period and where I specifically see, and I think historians are coming to see, the way that the creations of German Judaism, the creations, and when we say German, I'm going to mean Habsburg too, but we'll just say German,
of course.
Which would get the Czechs a little upset, but we can mind them. And so what I wanted to look at was in some ways a new, I'll use the word typology of Jewish life that's created in the middle of the 19th century. So when we think about where Jews lived and who they were in the early part of the 19th century, we think about a fairly rural existence, small towns, small villages all across Central Europe in the German states. And then when they move to cities, they're confronted by many of the things that you bring up in your master's thesis, which are a centralized community, a politics, a rabbinical elite who have control over what people say and what they think, and have a particular politics to put forward. And I really argue that in the 19th century that was really useful, that this was really important, that it was less discriminatory towards particular groups of Jews and more a response to a need, a real sense that people who were very different are coming together. And what happened was that in the 19th century, that change really takes hold. So the creation of the central urban synagogue, where people who come there pay dues, or in the case of Germany, pay taxes, who then pay to the synagogues, and they appoint their rabbis who aren't from their towns and don't share their traditions, and they go to schools that have a different dialect than they do, and where their parents grew up thinking Judaism was something a little different than they're sending their kids to school thinking. And that by the turn of the 20th century, that model of rabbinical, sort of a rabbi in a synagogue in a town, Jews living in cities, really becomes the model that it proliferates in England and in the Commonwealth, so throughout the British territories, and then very much in the United States. So in the early part of the 20th century, you get a whole bunch of Jewish organizations starting related interrelated synagogue activities. So the United Synagogue of Judaism or the Young Israel movement, which are related urban synagogues with a rabbi who sits in them and people who come to them who are very different. And then I really think that starts in Central Europe, that really starts about 100 years before. And that one of the great tragedies, of course, of the 20th century is that German Judaism, we didn't get to see, in many cases, though you'll hopefully argue somewhat against this, we didn't get to see what happened to German Judaism. I mean, we have sort of the typical...
Yeah, we also don't see what happens to Eastern Judaism in a lot of cases as well, too.
Right.
And we do in some ways with secularization attempts that happen in the Soviet Union, but this is another side of the equation as well, too. What happens, when modernity really kicks into hyperdrive in this case?
Well, so and many of those, I assume both of our families, came here in the sort of the post-1880s moment to America, and I think that they actually copied more of the German model. When they came here, either they went to synagogue or they didn't, but in many cases they did at some level, and they gave up on the Eastern European life, except for the Hasidim, of course, and the Haredim, who really proliferated in the post-war period. But that they sort of also fall into this Central European model that's developed 100 years before in Central Europe. So sort of thinking about then the Anglo-American model as this very post-war, very vibrant, questionable in terms of people's happiness with it, but very vibrant set of movements and dynamic synagogues. You see something very different in Germany. Will you tell us sort of, many of these people had lived during the war in the West, so they came back in the post-45 period with some idea of what Judaism looked like outside of Germany, but they encounter something really different in the post-war period. Do you see relationships? Do you see differences?
Mm-hmm. So what's interesting, I guess, in this case is that it's a two-sided question. It's a comparative study. So in East Germany and West Germany, you do have a lot of people that are, like you're talking about, these people, you can call them remigres on some level. These folks that go abroad already at the start of the 1930s once the Nazis have come to power. And it's already questionable before the Nazis come to power what their connection to Judaism is on many levels. Most of the folks that will eventually go back to East Germany have disavowed any Jewish connection that they had or any Jewish identity that they had during their youth, or their parents even. There was a connection to revolutionary politics on a lot of levels. So in the Eastern case, you see folks that go back in the late 1940s, and what's interesting about the German case, and I guess it should be explained here, is that you have to sort of officially declare yourself a part of the German Jewish community. Right. You mentioned taxes before as well, too. This is part of this. So in the East German model of society, Judaism is something that is strictly a religious phenomenon. There's not enough room necessarily to have any kind of rival culture, to dominant culture in a socialist society. So what eventually happens in generally the late 1970s, start of the 1980s, is that we see that the children of these folks feel a sense of alienation from social society, and that in their search to form some kind of a new identity for themselves, they're attracted to this lost Jewish identity on some level. And that when they are exploring this, especially towards the end of the 1980s, when there is some loosening in the way society can function in East Germany, they actually turn to this Anglo-American model that you talk about, in the sense that they're inspired by trips to see relatives in New York, for example, and other parts of the United States, and England. And that there's almost this idea that there should be some kind of reclamation of this model that'll happen. And this happens in West Germany as well, too. You have these remigres that are there. You also have the children of displaced persons that are largely from what now constitutes Poland, parts of Eastern Europe. So in a sense, there is this major rupture in Jewish life in Germany, and that this question comes about, can we even speak of any continuity in these communities from the pre-war period to the post-war period? So again, this reclamation goes on the Western side as well too, and I think it is almost sort of this search for continuity on some level in reimagining how it can function there.
And so one of the interesting things I saw in your work was that there's a worry, a bit of a worry in terms of how much they use the religious space, right? So these people aren't necessarily religious in the way that we think about faith or belief in God, or they don't want to pray 3 times a day. But they're drawn to the historic synagogues in Berlin, the few that survive, the ones that are allowed to be rebuilt or reconstituted. And so one of the interesting things is the model that they see is that of a synagogue-based or a center-based Judaism, right? There aren't enough Jews to make a whole socialist Jewish neighborhood, so they have to go to a shared space. How do they negotiate that space if we'll just talk about East Germany for the moment, how do they negotiate figuring out where that space is going to be, whose apartment is it going to be, and then how do they think about that, just from your reading, how do they think about what that space is maybe in both a cultural, since when they go to see relatives in America or live in America, it's a very cultural space too. How do they think about that?
Yeah. So in East Germany, the populace doesn't have a right to free association. So you can't actually build new organizations necessarily unless they are somehow part of the state apparatus in this case. So when folks do finally start to officially organize, in East Berlin in this case, which is where I'm focused, they have to sort of go through this community that they feel estranged from on many levels. This is a group of maybe about, I don't know, let's say 100 or 200 folks that still cling to some identification with religious Judaism, but at the same time, there hasn't been a rabbi in East Berlin since 1966 full time. Even when it comes to major high holiday services in the Jewish calendar, they'll often bring in clergymen from other countries in the Eastern Bloc or from West Berlin as well. So you see people working with this established system and sort of finding a way to create some group within this established structure on some level. And the ways in which they're going about exploring their Jewish identity, this includes things as basic as figuring out what the Jewish calendar actually looks like. Many of these people have memories perhaps of growing up and having their family light candles on Shabbat or something resembling a Seder that was simply described to them as a meal in this case. And in many ways, these folks actually, what's interesting, you were talking about this idea of a Jewish neighborhood. You sort of have de facto Jewish neighborhoods in the sense of the way that the migration pattern works for these remigres when they come back, because they largely associate with each other. So even though religion's not a question beforehand, there already is this kind of a subculture of Jewish life in East Berlin that exists before. So they're working through the structure of the community, and they create working groups. They have plays, things like The Dybbuk, this great classic Yiddish play. They put on a production of this. And they are able to even bring in people from the outside world. At one point in 1988, someone from the Chabad Lubavitch movement just sort of, from what I've read, shows up, in this case, at the border crossing between East and West Berlin on Hanukkah and comes on over and discuss some more let's say, pluralistic approaches towards Judaism, things that are more inclusive in this community. So I want to go back. I thank you for bringing up the idea of space here. And a lot of this is about negotiating space, but also constructing space in both the 20th century and also in the 19th century. So, when you have this mass migration of Jews that are coming to these cities, what are some of the ways in which we see people trying to create a distinctively Jewish space in a place like Leipzig, for example, where Jelinek goes to study?
Right. So we see it in a number of ways, and one of them is in where people choose to live, right? The apartment houses. And in the middle of the 19th century, especially after the 1848 revolutions, these cities are growing rapidly, so lots of people are moving into them. All sorts of Christians from all places in Central Europe, and then Jews, and they tend to go in larger numbers to similar neighborhoods. I know that one of your professors, Karen Auerbach, her book talks about this in Warsaw. This one apartment building after the war that still has all these Jewish families who know it, they don't know it. It's a fascinating story.
It's these subcultures that form.
These subcultures that form. And then one of the sort of the great 19th century Jewish great historians of 19th century German Judaism, David Sorkin, talks about this with the embourgeoisement of Judaism and of a Jewish subculture within the German middle class. But that's not quite enough, right? So that's enough if you live in a small town. It's enough if all the men go to the synagogue most of the time, right? It's unclear, I think, how much people went. I probably would offer it was more than liberal historians like to say it was, but it was probably less than I would like to imagine it was. But that women knew what you got an education. The men and the women knew at 13 what their obligations were. And so there was a sense at which sort of everybody in the small village kind of knew what their role was. And then, of course, if you're under the obligations where your taxes and your contracts all have to go through the rabbinical authority, then you very much understand how that works. But in cities, one of the things we see is the massive building of Jewish infrastructure at these synagogues that your people go to in Berlin. I don't think any of them existed before about 1860.
Probably not.
That they're all brand new. That there were a few sort of house synagogues, maybe a couple but they were in private dwellings mostly, or in people's storefronts. And that there's a real push on the part of the community to support an active building program, right? So they get into this. Europe starts to rebuild, right? We think of Paris as rebuilding under Haussmann and Napoleon III, but this happens in every German city. I mean, Berlin expands massively, right? You go to Berlin now, and the center of Berlin is just the empty Alexanderplatz. But that was the historic city center, and all the rest of it was built in the middle of the 19th century. And so they build schools. In Leipzig, there's still, it's being renovated, so they say, on Goldschmidtstrasse, the women's school, right there, just outside of the middle of town, right next to, in Leipzig, for example, right next to the St. Thomas Church, Bach's church, is right just 2 blocks on the other side of the ring is where they build the big central synagogue. So Jews have a sense. It's very interesting how quickly you would think this sort of second-class people would keep their heads down for a little longer, but they actually don't. They really assert this incredible newfound emancipatory authority to build synagogues where they want them, to build them in public spaces. We could sort of, the metaphor be, they put the Hanukkah candles back in the window if they'd have had to hide them. They really very quickly. And so there is this sort of Jewish space becomes something that you go to because it's no longer necessarily your house. Mordechai Breuer talks about this, even in the Orthodox community in Frankfurt. German Orthodox Jewish houses look like German houses. They had a lot of German novels, and sometimes they kept their shops open on Shabbats. That it was the synagogue that becomes the central place, and which is why your people are so interesting, because the synagogue, it draws people, and we saw this in a recent talk that we both went to, where people, when they go back to Europe, take lots of pictures of synagogues. I mean, you can say, though, this house was owned by Jews, but I can't imagine people are going to take that many pictures of an apartment building. But they really like the public infrastructure. They like the schools. They like seeing the synagogues. And there's something about that in modernity, that sort of the physical space. Do you see that too with your people? How do they negotiate that?
So with my people, what's interesting is that specifically, in both cases, I'll speak more to the Western German half in this case, in Frankfurt am Main, you have folks that feel stifled by the establishment and this very small insular Jewish community that's made up of people that are displaced persons or remigres. And so it becomes a question then about contestation over space. What can actually constitute a Jewish space in a place like Frankfurt? So I think it's interesting to bring up the fact that the school in Leipzig is so close to the Thomaskirche is really interesting. In my case, you even will see people going to what could be termed Christian spaces and using these as sort of portable or momentary Jewish spaces. They'll go outside of the city to, there's the Taunusberg, this mountain outside of Frankfurt, and there's a Lutheran academy base there. So people will go there, they'll go to the Catholic Student Union. So it's more about finding, I guess, in this case, ways outside of the synagogue to express Jewish life.
Right.
Coming through in West Germany.
Which to me, so, I mean, I'll put an argument out there, which to me feels pre-19th century, right? It says Judaism or Jewish space or Jewish culture is the creation of is a communal creation, right? God rests, we can put God in quotations if you wish. God rests, the holiness of the community rests when the people come together in a space. I mean, it's so fascinating you talk about using Christian spaces. I would have thought about that as a very American phenomenon, right? I wouldn't have thought Europeans would feel, Germans especially, would feel comfortable with that. That I've known many synagogues where, especially on the high holidays, the church next door becomes another service, or the community center down the street, or the Y. But that happens in Germany too. Is in some ways, these people are trying to unconsciously, or they're figuring out a way to make a Jewish expression out of any space or out of a community, which is not something we see easily done, I think, in the early 20th century. Judaism becomes something you go to, something that, especially when people talk about going just on the holidays. Then it's like, what does that mean, you go on the high holidays? It means you go to a space where someone else puts on high holiday services, and then you go home and you go to Little League. But these people are making a conscious effort, and they're saying, I'm going to a Lutheran school or a Lutheran space, but it's a Jewish space, and that's a whole different experience.
Yeah, and I think that this maybe speaks to some issues of movement and migration that we can see in both of our works in this case. This is something that can be related to the fact that Judaism, throughout its history, has relied on this notion of portability in a lot of ways. Whether you're in the wilderness and you're moving around, this tabernacle with you, or the idea of setting up synagogues in diaspora, in this case, outside of Israel, sort of the idea that you can recreate some kind of unity where you go. And I think we see this as well with your folks in the 19th century, that this is how they negotiate these changes of urbanization and of rapid migration that are taking place.
Right. And no, I think that's wonderful, and it also somewhat speaks to the critique that many postmoderns have had of modernity, of declaring too much, and the critique of non-German Jews or post-war German Jews, of the German Jewish experience, of saying they anchored too much, they had too much faith in this land, right? And they built synagogues that were too big. One of the funny things that happens in America is American Jews do the same thing. And so I wondered if you could, while I was reading your paper, I thought, I wonder what this says about the American Jewish community. Or, I mean, we're here in the Research Triangle, and there are synagogues, but there are a lot of Jews who don't go to those synagogues or participate much. But it's America, so they feel okay saying that they're Jews, or they feel tormented, but they're okay with the torment.
That's part of the Jewish experience.
It's part of the Jewish
though, right?
experience, at least in modernity, right? So what do your people say? I mean, you're not an anthropologist of America, so I don't mean to put you on the spot, but are there connections that you can make? Maybe more in the West German experience, but especially in the Germans in the East once the wall comes down.
Yeah, no, there absolutely are connections. This is something where, in many cases, the model of pluralistic communities in the United States, where you can have, this model where, it's like, there's that old joke, that, there's a guy in a desert island and he builds two synagogues. So one is the one that I go to and the other one is one that I never set foot in.
Right.
And this is something that you largely don't have in Germany. You'll maybe have one synagogue in these smaller communities, and there's this desire to have these varied approaches. I mean, there's someone in the East German case, her name's Irene Runge. She goes to New York and she stumbles upon a Marxist Talmud reading group which for her and for other folks that she talks to, where they believe, if I'm going to be a Marxist, I have to be an atheist. This totally precludes any connection to Judaism. This is a radical shift in their mind for how they can actually interface with Jewish culture and Jewish religion on many levels.
Right.
And then in the West, too, what's really interesting, I think, is that there is a dialogue that gets set up a lot of times in face-to-face conferences that take place, but also via written venues where you see Jews that have some kind of a Central European ancestry in the States who become academics. People like Harold Bloom, for example, other major thinkers, sort of reimagine what it means to have sort of a legacy of Central European Jewry during this period as well, too. So it's this transnational and transatlantic conversation that goes on that's informing what's happening in the late 80s in both places, which is really interesting.
Right.
So I have one more question for you, Sam, and this is maybe a little bit less related to what you specifically are writing about in your paper, but there's this notion that, I think you heard 1985 at one point, you said is sort of this crisis state for this Anglo-American world. I think about the end of the Cold War and the fact that, in this Anglo-American sphere, you now have roughly 10% of the Jews living there are folks that are from the former Soviet Union. And I'm wondering what ramifications you think this might have for the Anglo-American model.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. We had many of them come to the United States as well, right? And Israel has many of them. I wonder, right? So what I really see, and this is outside of my academic qualification, but since it's YouTube, I guess we can talk about what we wish. Then I really see the model as breaking down in many ways, and somewhat from the Russians and somewhat from the millennials. That one of the things about millennials, the two of us, we don't like to pay dues. I'm not going to move to a town and start paying dues. So we want the services that these places provide, services both religious and just communal. But then we also want to always have a step out, and we want to say, I wonder what Judaism else looks like, right? That already in the 1950s, Abraham Joshua Heschel talked about his great cry was that American prayer is terrible. It's just so uninspiring. It's so unpleasant. Now, one of the things that I've experienced in Central Europe is that that's not the case. That many of these communities are much more exciting religiously to go to. But even if you're not excited by religion, and many of the Russians do go there, that there's got to be something else. That there's got to be a community in which we say, well, Jews move to Trinity Park here in Durham, not because they want to go to the synagogue in Trinity Park, but because it's close to the university and the synagogue and walking to downtown. And then when you do that, you meet other members of your community along the way. And to sort of, and I think one of the things that millennials do by moving back into these smaller and post-industrial cities in America is to reconstitute in many ways the lives that your people are starting to move towards, right? That we want to all live in the same apartment buildings. We want to get together and study Talmud in our way. And we want religious leadership to be there in case we struggle over a translation or we don't know how to read Hebrew at all. But we don't necessarily want the sort of the staid model that wasn't staid in the 1850s,
right?
But became in the sort of early 20th century, and especially in the post-war period, a really staid model. I remember from all the synagogues growing up that how much fuss was made over the new rabbi, right? God forbid the fuss should have been over how to make prayer more fun and more interesting and more vibrant and more lively. And that I wonder if these, the Russians especially, who had grown up in such a communal setting, right? There were these amazing stories about what the Soviet Union was like, about how much people shared hot water, right? I have my own tank, and yet
when they could get hot water,
right? That I wonder if in a place like Germany, and if the millennials in the United States aren't going to sort of diversify what it means to be part of the Jewish community. That I'm not sure you would say, I wonder if either of us would say we're part of the Triangle Jewish community. I'd have a hard time saying that. I'm not a member of a synagogue. I don't live in a Jewish neighborhood. But that's unfair, historically unfair, and I think especially what your people give us is a model that says this doesn't have to be the only way, and Chabad certainly doesn't need, though they do remarkable work, it doesn't have to be the only place that provides a house for Jews in some place like Chapel Hill.
Sure. I think this also gets to this issue, which I look at, and which I think comes up in yours as well too, in the sense of how do people perform their Judaism? How do people actually conceive of themselves doing this? I think that there's a Heschel quote as well too about praying with his feet in this case. I think about the fact that while neither of us belong to any formal Jewish community, I certainly don't down here either, there is this very vibrant world for Jewish studies in the Triangle, and that this is a group in which I think there is some kind of a Jewish experience that's taking place. I may not go to shul more than 2 or 3 times a year, but I go to these seminars, I go to these various lectures, I take these courses. So it's about finding these new ways, these new approaches for Jewish spaces on many levels.
And one of the interesting things are a turn I thought maybe this conversation would take, wasn't sure, was into the autobiography, right? The really interesting, one of my good friends is a German who does Jewish studies, right? You know her, and she really actually struggles in Jewish studies spaces. In a way she's negotiated, but in a way of sometimes feeling left out, right? The Association for Jewish Studies is like 80 or 85% Jewish, and there becomes a way in which, say, our conversation has taken a turn of, oh, are you a member of the synagogue or are you not? And that I wonder if, rather than seeing the negative side, which is, oh, Jews just colonized Jewish studies, is to say, Jews are looking for various communities in a world that, though America is big and diverse, actually doesn't have a lot of communities. And so it feels terrible to the 15% who aren't Jewish, but then we can say, well, this is actually an anthropological moment for our own study, which is to say, we're going to be some of the good thinkers in Judaism in the 21st century, hopefully. And so as many or more of the great Jewish thinkers are going into academia and going into business than going into the rabbinate. So they're going to make those spaces into Jewish spaces at some level, and then figuring out diversity and whatever. But how does that sound? Does it feel awkward? Does it feel wrong? Should we have stopped this conversation 10 minutes ago?
So does it feel wrong that there are non-Jews involved in this space?
No, certainly there should be non-Jews, but I wonder how we say, well, we make a Jew. We feel like we're having a Jewish experience,
like right now.
Like right now,
in this
absolutely.
Video, this is a very Jewish experience.
It's a very Jewish experience, and yet I that's wonderful for us, and I want to say, well, of course, if there were someone who wasn't Jewish here, he or she would be welcome. But it would be, could they experience a Jewish space? And then that goes into conversion, of course. But are the various who counts as being Jewish, and your people certainly deal with that at a much bigger level. But sort of, how are we to deal with that? Should we back off? Should we?
It's a really good question. I mean, this is it's great to blow it out into this issue of what is the future and what is the role of Jewish studies, where this is something. I think about the fact that in the 50s we're talking about this strength coming forward in the Anglo-American model. This is when you have, even a little bit beforehand, chairs in Jewish history, chairs in Jewish studies, ideas of Jewish studies coming about in American universities. This is a field, like so many of these fields, it's always this question, I guess, about how strong personal identity is in any kind of scholarship on many levels, and where to make space beyond that on some level, I guess. This tension between identity and something that comes out of the 19th century, this idea of a scientific study of Judaism.
Right.
There's that internal tension there. I have no idea what the next step should be. It's a fascinating question.
Right.
But it's a good one to bring up.
Yeah, no, and I think we would both agree that we both think that there is such a thing as scholarship, which is not just identity, right? It's not, I read your paper, and your paper doesn't have to be written by someone Jewish. Now, it's motivated by your interest in these people and your time in Germany and your linguistic skill, but it doesn't have to be. No one needs to read this and say, oh, this author is Jewish. and yet somehow us talking about it creates a
Jewish
really
space.
vibrant Jewish space.
Yeah.
And so I actually think that's a really positive thing. And I wonder if you can create a positive, vibrant Jewish space with someone who's not Jewish, or if you need the majority. I mean, these are all, we don't have to go down that road. But it is a question for what the diaspora looks like. And especially in the United States, where you have so many Jews in scholarship, which is not necessarily the case in German universities.
No,
Right.
no. Not enough Jews in that case anymore, I guess.
Right.
But a lot of them do go towards scholarship, and the folks I'm looking at in West Germany, and in East Germany too, which is interesting. So I don't know. No, good questions for the future.
Yeah. Well, so
Yeah, so I think that's roughly the end of our conversation. I'll turn back to the main camera in this case. Just want to thank the Council for European Studies at Duke for enabling this research and enabling the kind of vibrant conversation like this one that I could have with Sam on this morning.
yeah, thank you, Max.
Pleasure.